Welcome to this kick-off meeting for the Friends of the Ullswater Way Understanding Ullswater Evening Talks. This is the first one of the series we have this year. I'll talk maybe at the end on the next one in our series. As we've done before, we're trying to do this in a sort of hybrid format. So we have live in a village hall plus an online audience. We're hoping we don't have any technical glitches. Let's see how it turns out. Next week we have a Friends of the Ullswater Way trustees meeting, and I'll be passing the chair to Gordon. My name is Tim Clark. I've been chair for several years, and as part of a sort of democratic rotation process, we're passing the chair to Gordon, who is one of the founder members of the Friends of the Ullswater Way, as indeed Miles McInnes, who's in the audience here today. And my wife is playing the piano, looking after the Zoom audience, and will be gathering questions during the course of the evening. It's a huge honor and privilege for us to have, I have to say that. No, I mean it actually, I really do. It's a huge honor and privilege for us to have Lois Mansfield with us today. She has an extraordinary academic reputation. I mean that in a very positive sense. She's a professor of Upland landscapes at the Ambleside campus of the University of Cumbria, where she is the campus director and the director of the Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas. And she wanted me to say this, that she has spent 25 years doing research on upland agriculture, and in her words, still has at least the same amount of learning to do on this topic. She's represented and chairs the Lake District World Heritage Site Technical Advisory Group, and is a very strong advocate for hill farming in Cumbria. She's going to speak to us for however much time she wishes. We'll have a question and answer session afterwards. I think with those very few words, I will pass the floor to Lois. I wish you luck, and we will wait with bated breath to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for Tim and Anne for inviting me, and also for the Ullswater Way group to invite me to come and speak to you tonight. Tim specifically asked me to talk about the future of hill farming in Cumbria, but also specifically in relation to Ullswater. And I think I was a bit like, oh gosh, that's quite focused, that's quite direct. And I thought, well, how am I going to do that? And how am I going to sort of put that together for people? And one of the things that I learned is that we don't know very much. And hopefully during this talk, there'll be some ideas and perhaps things that the friends could do to actually learn more about their own valley. So that's also part of the reason that I felt that I think this was quite an interesting talk to do. I have been researching farming for 25 years. I don't know all the answers. But if I was to answer this question, is there a future for hill farming in Cumbria and Ullswater, I would have to say yes. So that's the end of my talk. So, and I know it's a very, very controversial subject at the moment. I know it's very deeply ingrained in the community. I know there's a lot of passion. I know there's a lot of tension and a lot of conflict about this. And my husband always says, oh, you're walking into the lion's den there. But I suppose if you don't stick your head over the parapet and you don't speak up, then the things that you feel passionate about won't go anywhere, and that will be that. And I think the hill farming community deserve being advocated because they've created this landscape in the Lake District. They've created many of our upland landscapes, and hopefully I'll give you some idea today about some of the issues and tensions and conflicts and ways forward. So I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow account of absolutely everything about hill farming because we'll be here forever. I don't wish to teach farmers to suck eggs either, and I know there's farmers in the audience here in the hall and also on the Zoom, but these are just some ideas that I've sort of collated and thought about over the last few years. So I'm interested in being corrected if I'm wrong, because I'm still learning, and I think that's really important, and I think it's important that we have dialogue. So without further ado, is there a future for hill farming in Cumbria and Ullswater? Hopefully I'm going to get this to work. There you go, already. Oh, here we go. So what I'd like to cover tonight, specifically because Tim was very keen that I did this, is I thought it was important that we actually put some context on hill farming. People tend to talk about it in an abstract way and talk about hill farming per se, but I think I'd like to introduce a little bit about the character and the value of the rural economy and the rural society in Cumbria, Ullswater and Aston Woods, because this is the way I sort of thought I'd approach it. Think a little bit about the character and importance of upland agriculture, for those of you that are not so familiar. The big issue, the tension between what we call nature and culture in upland farm landscapes, and that's, I think, is the biggest hunting ground for people with many different views and opinions. And then I'd like to go on and think a little bit more about how we actually find the balance between all those different competing needs that we have in relation to uplands, with the farm sort of sitting in the middle. And then think about some of the opportunities for upland agriculture and looking forwards, because we have to look forwards, we can't keep looking backwards, and we know that there are big issues that we have to deal with. We know there's nature recovery, we know there's climate action that we have to do. We're all in this together, nobody's isolated from this, so we all play our part. So I'm interested in looking forward and talking about some opportunities that I think that the hill farming community could exploit, and the key role that they play for all of us in relation to the land management that they conduct for us. And most importantly, and people often forget this, they actually produce food as well, and we need food. And increasingly we need food, particularly as the global population increases. And of course the food goes up and transport costs go up, and we don't want to move stuff around the globe and so on and so forth. So I suppose one of the things I'd like you to think about tonight is to think about, from your perspective, what do we want from Ullswater and Aston? What is it that you want to do in your valley moving forward, because you are a community? And every community in Cumbria is different. And that's what makes studying upland agriculture interesting for me, is that everything is different, nothing is the same, nothing works for everybody, and it's very much one farm after the next, after the next. They all have different assets, they all have different skill bases and different knowledge, and therefore there's no one solution. And I think that's one of the reasons why I definitely have a real problem with upland agriculture, getting their head around it, is because of the vast variation, and they can't just make a big general edict and go, there you go, that will solve the problem, everybody, because it doesn't work like that. I wish it did, but it doesn't. Okay, so things about the Cumbrian rural economy generally. The total GVA, gross value added, i.e. how much cash we get from the rural economy in Cumbria, is about £10.7 billion a year, and about 18% of that comes from the rural economy. Of that, 62% of businesses are rural, and 52% of our employment is rural. And again, people tend to forget that we are a very rural county, and therefore our GVA is very much related to what goes on in rural areas. When we talk about the rural economy, for those of you that are perhaps thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, as boring academics, we sort of split it into two lumps. We talk about what's called consumptive rural economy. So that's where we take stuff out of the system. So that includes agriculture, forestry, and mining. And then we talk about non-consumptive stuff, such as the water supply industry, biodiversity conservation, tourism, recreation, and heritage management. So we're not actually extracting, or we're not supposed to be extracting stuff out of the environment and damaging it in some way. But those two lumps come together, and that's what the rural economy is. The other part of the equation is rural society. So that's me and thee, us living here. So it's what we call the population, or the demography, and I'll look at that in a minute. It's service provision, it's settlements patterns, and it's communities. And the two come together, and they are interrelated with each other, and they create the rural landscape. So that's what you see out there, and that's what we see every day when we're driving around, or walking around, or whatever it is we do. So what does it look like in a bit more detail in relation to Aston and Ullswater wards? So I tried to focus it right down to make it relevant for you. This is a percentage of businesses that exist in the two wards. So blue is Aston, red is Ullswater, and then just to give you a yardstick for England are the grey sticks there. So two things that stand out, hopefully. First of all, on the far left, you can see how important agriculture and forestry is in relation to businesses in the Aston and Ullswater wards. And that, I think, is really important. People tend to forget that, but it is important. And secondly, you can also see that accommodation and food services, which is what you and I would generally call tourism, if you wanted to lump it together, is probably the most dominant thing in the Ullswater and Aston wards. And you can see that Ullswater has much more accommodation and food services than Aston. And Aston is a little bit more agriculture and forestry based business. So there are some differences between the two areas. And then in comparison to the England averages, you can see it's just completely different. And again, that's part of the issue, is that those in Whitehall don't actually get that variation, that how colossally different it is around here and how our economy functions in a completely different way. And often they will pick off bits to support or not support, and they don't understand the way it all interconnects, and that actually helps destabilise it. And it's the destabilisation that causes many of the issues that we now struggle with. If you want a little bit more detail about the employment structure, just to give you an idea, the orange bit is basically the employment rate in the different wards and in relation to England. The green bit is the retired bit, which I find quite interesting. There's more people in the Aston ward that are retired than there are in the Ullswater ward. But as we all probably suspected, there are more retired people in this part of the Lake District than there are in England in general, where there's only 16%. If we were then, hopefully, to look at the other side of it, the rural society bit, so in case you don't know where your wards are, I thought I'd put a map up for you. I wasn't being insulting. I think it was more for my brain to get around it. Population is quite interesting. It's pretty much roughly the same in Aston and Ullswater. There's very few difference in it. The big difference, though, in relation to England is population density. So that's the number of people per square kilometre. Very, very low. And of course, the issue that we have there is that because you've got a low population density, it means it's difficult to generate large amounts of council tax to put into services to help the rural society that then helps to prop up the rural economy. So it's things like schools, roads, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So we're starting off from a point of being in a corner and being sort of fairly low down, and that ability to generate income to put back into the local economy to allow society to continue. If you want to look at the housing, which is one of the things we often look at in relation to societal issues, this is roughly what it looks like. Again, just as a comparator to get your head around it. It's quite interesting. In England, houses that are outright mortgaged houses and tenanted is roughly 1/3 each. It's very different in both Aston and Ullswater, and in fact, Aston and Ullswater are very different from each other as well in the way that their housing stock is organised. And that reflects the amount of money that's going around in the economy and the sorts of jobs that people do and so on and so forth. But that's all part of understanding the importance of agriculture. You might be thinking, why is she talking about this? But agriculture is part of this system and actually underpins a lot of this. So it's important to just have some basic facts and figures about, well, what are we talking about and how does that relate to England as a whole? Because it helps to explain some of the less understandable attitudes. An idea, our GVA for agriculture and accounts is about 925 million, which is about 9% of the total of the county's GVA, and that includes what we call businesses up and downstream of agriculture. So that's things like seed merchants and machinery at one end, and then food processing at the other. So up and downstream, it only accounts for about 9% of the GVA, and it only employs, as a county, about 12,000 people. But the important fact is that even though that's a very small GVA and the employment is very low, it covers 70% of our county's area. This is why it's so important for us as a county to think about our agricultural system. If you want to think about it on a national scale, Cumbria donates 13% of all sheep, 10% of the dairy herd, and 8% of the beef cattle, excuse me. The issue is, though, is that because we cover 70% of the county, there is this mechanism, this interrelationship between agriculture and forestry, our landscape and the visitor economy. So those three, they almost work like cogs together. So if we don't look after agriculture and forestry, it is going to have an impact on our landscape. And I'll look at that impact and the nature of that impact in a minute, because I know there's people going up already, but we'll get there. But the whole lot helps our visitor economy work. It's what people come to see. And while we who live here may see different things in that landscape, and we may have different views about how we see farming in that landscape, and some people may think it's overgrazed, and other people may think it's undergrazed. Generally, when visitors come to an area, they don't see what we see. They see a pastoral landscape. They see the landscape of Wordsworth, they see the picturesque and romantic movement. They don't see the level of detail that we're seeing. So from their point of view, if agriculture disappeared, the landscape would change irreparably, and it wouldn't be the landscape that they actually came to see in the Lake District, the picturesque and the romantic movement with walls and barns and sheep dotted about and all that sort of almost kitsch sort of pastoralism. So you can think about the importance of hill farming in different ways. You can think about it on the visitor economy level, where they're not looking at the detail, they're not looking at the habitats, they're not looking at perhaps the impact of carbon management or whatever it happens to be. They're not looking at that, they're looking at the bigger landscape. So that has to be taken into account, because the visitor economy is very important for Askham and Ullswater Wolds. It's very important for the economy of Cumbria per se. On top of that, our hill and up farming landscapes in Cumbria are very different. There are lots of different ways of looking at this. So, hang on, I've just got my mouse. There we go. So there are very different upland landscapes across Cumbria, and they're very different hill and up farming systems. And this demonstrates, even on this scale, how complicated understanding hill farming is, and how making generalizations about it is a really bad idea because of the subtleties. So even at what we call a massif level, so a big chunk of upland, you can see just from this range of photographs that there are very different upland farming landscapes, even just within one county. And then if you extend that to the whole of England, it becomes even more diverse. And again, that replicates this thing about trying to make decisions and making one decision for all. It doesn't work. So this sort of top-down approach that you get from Whitehall, it doesn't function in the landscape. And for us in Cumbria, it doesn't function very effectively because it's not understanding the diversity of landscapes that we have in relation to hill farming. And they're all slightly different, and they all operate slightly different ways, with slightly different things going into the farm system and popping out the other end. And most government policy doesn't take account for that variation. If you then take it down to another level and you think of the different valleys in the Lake District, they all look different. Well, they all look different because of the geology, the soils, the way the land's been managed, the history of that valley, what's happened previously in relation to its industrial heritage. They all look different, and even up one farm to the next, it looks different. The hillside looks different, the habitats look different. There's a mosaic of different vegetation on the hillside. And that makes it really difficult to manage on a large scale and make big scale decisions because of the variation. So if we then move it down to a farm scale, and I do apologise if the owner's a side farmer here, but I was trying to find an Ullswater photograph to use, and there was this one of side farm, so I do apologise if they're online or in the audience. But I think it is a nice example of what an upland farm looks like, a typical upland farm in the Lake District. It's made up of three types of land: the in-by land in the valley bottom, which is the best quality stuff. And when I say best quality, that tends to be what we call 3C or grade 4. There are only 5 grades of agricultural land in this country, and grade 1 is what you get on the washes. So it's really good stuff. It's where you can grow all sorts of stuff. It's very flexible. You can grow carrots and all sorts of sexy stuff. By the time you get to grade 5, which is the uppermost land in the Lake District, the mountainous bits, you're very limited in what you can do. Your choices are very limited because of slope, because of thinness of soil, because of climatic conditions. So immediately you're limited, and this is why upland farming looks the way it does in many uplands in this country, because you're limited by the quality of the land and the flexibility of the land to only carry out some sort of pastoral farming system. So you get grade 3C or grade 4 in the bottom of the valley, and then as you immediately go up onto the slopes, you go up into grade 5 land. There isn't anything worse than grade 5 in England. If you go to Scotland, there are 7 grades, which makes you worry. But what you've got is you've got in-by land, fields in the bottom. They're used often for haymaking. They were historically, or now they're used for silage. And then as you go up onto the hillside, they're what we call the intakes. And the intakes are literally bits of fell that have been taken in and walls put around them. And they tend to be what we call semi-improved. So they might have drainage systems in them, or they might not. And then finally, you have one wall that what we call the fell wall, which is the last wall before you get out onto the top, which you can see from the diagram on the left. And that's what we come on to what we call common land, or the unenclosed land. Some common land is shared amongst a number of commoners. And I believe you've had a talk from Julia about commoning, haven't you? So I'm sure you're all very familiar with that now, so I don't need to go into that. But sometimes over the fell wall, the land can belong to one owner, and that's what we call sole grazing. But the land itself is still grade 5, and it still has limitations agriculturally. And then what you get in the valley bottom is you get the classic dry stone walls, you get the farmhouse and the farm buildings and the related buildings to that, a lot of which have lost their main original use and are now used for other purposes. So for upland farming in Cumbria, and particularly in the Ullswater area and in the Lake District, and classically across most of Cumbria and many uplands in the UK, you've got a common system with the land rights to graze sheep but owned by another person. You have a hefting system where the livestock, if it's a commoner, basically put up onto the fell, and the sheep, the mothers, the ewes, show their offspring where their piece of land is. They teach that behaviour, and there are no fences at all, and so the animals pass that knowledge on from one generation to the next, which is why having continuity in a flock is so important, because if you don't have that heft knowledge to pass on to the next generation, then when you put the sheep up there the following year, they just go, what the? And they just go everywhere and they're gone because they don't understand where their piece of land is. So this is what people worried about during foot and mouth is, will the hefting system perpetuate? Because the way it used to work is that the shepherd would go up there with a dog or 2 dogs, and they would put them back on the heft on a daily basis. And eventually the sheep got the idea that this is where we belong and we shouldn't really be going anywhere else. Although a lot of them do just have often wander off. You get 1 or 2 that just wander for miles. And in the Lake District, the sheep can wander for 40 kilometres before it hits another fell wall. And that causes a problem for the farmer, because if there aren't enough people using the common and those hefts are all interlocking, then the pressure on the grazing pressure reduces. The sheep wander further because there's less competition from their neighbours, and sheep can wander for very long distances. And then for the farmer, they have to get the lorry, drive round into the next valley, find their sheep when they get to the shepherd's meet and say, or somebody's yard, and they said, actually, we've got 10 of your sheep. When the hefting system was fully functional, and I'm only talking like 20 years ago, you've got very little drift, 1 or 2 sheep perhaps would drift, the nut jobs that just have to go and do something different. Now you're getting instances where people have to pick up 20, 30, 40 sheep. And the reason for that is the stocking densities have come down so low that there's no pressure competition between the animals, and they start wandering everywhere. And while that might be very good for the habitat, it might not necessarily be very good for the farm business, because you're spending money trying to bring those sheep back and gather them all up. Other things that are important in relation to our farming system to gather, obviously the periodic bringing down of the stock to the farm for various reasons, whether to sell or to lamb or to worm. Years ago, people used to lamb on the hillside. Nobody does that now because the thought of it is just horrifying. So the livestock are brought down to the farm. There are also changes in the way that farmers are asked to manage their sheep on the fell in relation to something called overwintering. Whereas instead of the stock being on the fell now, they take them off and they have to take them somewhere else. And that's part of their agri-environment agreement in order that they can get agri-environment payments. That sounds great for the habitat, but for the farm and for the sheep, that can cause problems, because the sheep begin to forget where their heft is, and actually that can cause problems when they bring the stock back onto the fell the following year. And then finally, we have this weird thing which is unique globally called the sheep stratification system, which I'm not going to blow everybody's boredom with. But basically what happens is that sheep that in the hill areas are sold to farmers in the upland areas for crossbreeding, and then the upland farmers sell their sheep to the lowland farmers for crossbreeding. So sheep that we breed in the Lake District crossbred with upland sheep lower down the fell, and those are then bred with lowland sheep, which could be all over the country. So our entire meat system, our entire sheep industry in this country is interlocking. So if the upland, if the hill farmers stop farming, then it actually has a cascade failure across the whole system. And people often don't realise how destabilising that could actually be of that whole system. And it's all about genetics and breeding and making sure that the stock is of good enough quality to allow us to put it on the table for people to eat. And I'll talk about food obviously a bit later. And then at times the process reverses itself, and slowly sheep move to the uplands and sheep crossbreed with the upland sheep, and the upland sheep go and crossbreed with the hill sheep, and back they go. In other parts of the system, people try to make sure that the purity of their sheep is maintained, so that you will have people that breed just Herwick sheep. And so obviously around here that's really important because they're indigenous to the Lake District. They aren't indigenous to anywhere else in the world. So once the Herwick sheep are gone, that's it. And every year the number of pests with Herwick sheep and the number of people producing Herwicks gets less and less. And that has an impact on World Heritage status. And World Heritage status brings in more tourists. So that's roughly what a classic upland farm looks like. Obviously, there's lots of differences depending on where you are in the Lake District and where you are in the different upland areas. Those rural landscapes that are created by upland landscapes, we basically call them cultural landscapes because they are landscapes produced by human activity. So pretty much everything in the British Isles is a cultural landscape. It is not wilderness at all. There are about 5,000 or 6,000 hectares of real wilderness left in the British Isles. The rest of it is a product of people's relationship with the environment. So this is a wheel that Natural England are very keen on using, and it shows how all the different things come together to create a cultural landscape. So things related to the natural environment, cultural and social processes, and perceptions and aesthetics of how we look at the landscape and how we appreciate it as individuals. So the wheel shows how many aspects of places in which we live, the people we are, and the things we do come together to create the cultural landscape. And that cultural landscape will look different in every place, which is why you get that variety in the Lake District and in the, if you look at one end of Ullswater to the other, and if you look at the different uplands in Cumbria, and then you look at the different uplands across the UK. Landscapes are therefore a product of what we call tangible structures, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and intangible processes. So things and people come together and react with each other and create cultural landscapes. And that's an important point to remember. They're also constantly changing landscapes. And again, we must remember that we can't hold things static. And in some respects, if you talk to World Heritage International, they're a bit obsessed with keeping things in aspect just as it was at the inscription. But landscapes change, they evolve, things happen. We are going to have to tackle climate change. We are going to have to tackle nature recovery. So what that landscape looks like now will be different in 5 years, and it'll be different in 10 and different in 20. And I'm not saying that that's not going to happen, but how we do that is important. If we want to maintain our cultural landscape, which is recognised internationally and brings 20 million visitors a year, which lots of people in the Askham and Ullswater wards benefit from financially. So the landscape of yesterday is not necessarily the landscape of tomorrow. So what is this cultural landscape that I've just yapped on about? Well, what it's made up of, what physical things, the tangible things like buildings, structures, sites, locations, products, habitat. That is all part of a cultural landscape. So the photograph at the end is a hay meadow. That hay meadow is produced through farming. Okay, and we haven't got very many hay meadows left because it doesn't produce a lot of dry matter that's good for livestock, so people tend to switch to silage. That's why that's happened. But if we then support haymaking and bringing back hay meadows and at a good rate, then people will may move back to haymaking if they think it's part of their farming system. But we wouldn't have those hay meadows if it wasn't for farming. They wouldn't exist. It was brought by the Romans to this country as a way of producing fodder for livestock. The other side of the coin is the intangible stuff. And for us in the Lake District, that's really important. It's ideas, practices, beliefs, traditions. Not all traditions are good. I wouldn't say badger baiting and bear baiting are good traditions. We're very pleased that we don't do them anymore in this country, hopefully. Fingers crossed. Things like values and sense of place, all the sort of processes, the gathering, the hefting, all that intangible stuff you can't actually touch, but you can observe the product of it. That's all the intangible stuff. So it's things like agricultural shows and hedge laying and all those skills, those traditional skills that are really important. And hedgerows are really important in the environment because they create corridors, they link habitats together, they create more biodiversity. So making sure that skills get transmitted from one generation to the next is really important. And those two come together to produce something we do actually need, which is food. Whether you're vegetarian or not, I'm not going to apologise for that. It's a meat system, it's pastoral, it produces food. What we don't know is we don't have a lot of detail about Ullswater and Aston Walls in relation to tangible and intangible assets. We don't know very much about it. We know generally what goes on in Upland systems, but we don't have detail. So understanding how much wall you have, what's the condition of the wall, what's the condition of the hedges, how old are the hedges, how much hay meadow do you have, what's the status of farm woods. We don't have that information, it's just not available. So the more we know about our cultural landscape, the more we can work out how to conserve it and how we can use it economically to help maintain a farming system going forwards. The other side of the coin is hill farming produces a natural landscape, and I use that in inverted commas because this really winds me up. When you say the word natural, everybody thinks of wilderness. A natural landscape in the upland farming system and in the UK, as I just explained, most of it's produced by people doing various things. It roughly looks like this. So you get this spectrum of habitats from the valley floor right up to the top. We don't have snowbed communities in England because we don't have high enough altitude. So that would be for Scotland and for parts of the Carnarvon in Wales and Snowdonia, but we don't really get snowbed communities. Pretty much most of those other habitats are produced by the relationship between people managing that landscape in one way or another. Not just necessarily agriculture, some of it might be gamekeeping, some of it might be left over from previous systems that we no longer use or operate. But you get this range of habitats occurring from the valley floor to the top of the fells. There is evidence that's concrete, it's been done. A chap called Osterman, who was a Dutch researcher in Europe, he actually went and looked at all the different semi-natural habitats that exist in Europe, including the UK. And we can estimate that 44% of the semi-natural habitats, the things that everybody raves about, priority habitats that we want to try and maintain, under EU and UK legislation are directly derived from upland farming activity. So if we don't have upland farming, we don't have this range of habitats. Okay? So we have to make that decision whether we are quite happy to lose a farming system that produces this range of stuff, or whether we want to continue it and keep the range of habitats that we have. Again, we don't have the detail for Uskam and Ullswater. We don't know a lot about the level of the granularity, the real detail. The information that Natural England holds is for triple SIs only and NNRs, National Nature Reserves, Special Items of Interest. That's their remit. Outside those boundaries of those designations, we know nothing about the habitats in Cumbria. We don't know what's there, we don't know how much it is, we don't know the quality of it, we don't know the quantity of it, we don't have that information. And that's one of the biggest tasks as a Lake District community that we need to address, is we need to find out what's there, because if we don't know what's there, how can we look after it? So there's loads of stuff out there that desperately needs surveying. And it's not that difficult to do. I teach students to survey habitat stuff. I'm not an ecologist. I taught myself the ecology I needed to know in order to teach students how to survey a habitat. So it's not hard to do. And it's a coloured pencil job, and it's great fun. So what you've got is you've got nature and you've got culture, and they're sort of entangled together. So what we have is ideally what we would like is we'd like a World Heritage Site that acts as an umbrella that balances nature and culture. And they work in sync with each other. And ideally, this is what the Lake District the Lake District Partnership Plan should be trying to go towards, is creating balance. The problem we've got is we have situations where nature is subservient to culture. So the classic example that we can all think of is overgrazing. And yes, there is overgrazing. And if there's anybody from Natural England on there, where they go, Lois has just said the words overgrazing. Yes, there is overgrazing in the Lake District. It's a reality of 70 years of agricultural policy that has encouraged farmers to put more sheep on the land. Okay, they are not ultimately responsible for the policy that drives them. Because if somebody said to you, I'll give you money to do this, then you're going, okay, I'll do that. Okay, so from my point of view is we've had a policy system that's driven people to put too many sheep on the land in places, not everywhere, but in places. And that has meant that the nature, that all that lovely habitat that we saw has been degraded and the quality of it has gone downhill. And that's all that stuff about nature recovery that everybody's now banging on about. And our friend Mr. Monbiot, this land has been sheep-wrecked. Which bit of land are you talking about, my son? Which bit? Okay, because it's too complicated to make a generalisation. Generalisations are the death of everybody. And it's that generalisation that gets people to go, oh, story. Something here that I can sort of bang the drum about and get everybody whipped up about. But generalisations will kill us if we keep making generalisations, because generalisations are often made to make things simple for people to understand. But you can explain anything to anybody if you break it down into stages. And sometimes people are in too much of a rush to just make a big generalisation and say, their sheep wreck the uplands. I know there are parts of the How Gills that are absolutely knackered because they've been overgrazed, but there are other parts of the How Gills that are really, really full of fantastic habitat. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got situations where nature has sat on culture, and it's the other extreme, where you've got too few sheep being on the fell because stocking densities have been asked to be reduced in relation to allow habitat to recover, because we know we're overgrazing, so please reduce the stocking density. Farmers, in order to get the agri-environmental grants, have to reduce their stocking density. But now we're getting to the point, and I'm not going to beat around the bush, and I'm not going to mince my words, we're getting to the point where there's too much stock coming off, and it's actually destabilising the farm business. So I was talking to a farmer 2 days ago, and he was telling me that he had 900 sheep on his fell, and he'd been asked to reduce the stocking density. And he'd been asked, and that stocking density was made up of what we call the landlord's flock, which belongs to the person who owns the land, and then sheep he adds to it so that he can make a bit more profit. And he'd been asked to reduce it down to the point where he would only have 40 sheep left on the fell. And he said, at that point, I can't make a living on this heft anymore, so I'm going to stop farming on this heft. Now, you could say, well, that's great, that's going to recover. But there's lots of evidence that show if you take the sheep off, eventually you can get undergrazing. And you can get issues in relation to undergrazing. You get plants that grow up, they smother out the diversity. And because these habitats are created by grazing in the first place, we actually lose the very thing we wanted in the first place. What we need to be able to do is to allow this pendulum to swing back the other way gradually and not chop. Because if you just chop it and push it back too fast, then you get problems. And of course, at 40 sheep, it becomes impractical for that poor man to run all over the fell with his dogs and try and find his sheep, because they've all just gone, particularly if the landlord's flock is somewhere else at the time. So farmers are now thinking about abandoning the hefting system if they want the agri-environment payments. The other option is to say, right, we don't want the agri-environment payments anymore. And that's what's happened in Banks and Commons. So the question is we've got to do something about getting the bit in the middle, because that's really the important bit, is trying to find the balance between nature and culture, and not one dominating over the other, but finding ways forward that allow us to go, this is going to be a solution that we perhaps could use to help take the pressure off the amount of livestock and actually look at other opportunities. So what I'd like to do for the last part of this talk is to talk about some of the things that are opportunities, and we have to look at them as opportunities. We can't look at them as somebody coming in and beating us with a stick, because this is the new regime in which we now are in, and we have to accept this is what the game that we're going to have to play. Now, if you don't want to accept the game, you can retire, you can sell your farm. These are things that people don't want to do, because as people often say to me who are farmers, I'm hefted to the land. And some of those farms have been in that family for generations. There's a farm in the Howgills that's been in the same family from 1169. Why should you be the family to break that chain? The responsibility of legacy and going forwards for your children and your grandchildren is massive. It's not like me saying, oh, I'm fed up doing my job, I'm going to go and get another one. This is different. This is about people who are culturally bound to the land and they've created this landscape and their families have lived in this area for generations. And you're suddenly saying to them, stop farming. And if you stop farming, we'll give you £100,000 and you can go and buy a house in Penrith. Well, who can buy a house for £100,000 in Penrith who's come from a rural area and is suddenly dumped in a town setting? So we need to look at those opportunities. What can we do? So the first thing, the big thing, is the public goods agenda. And people say, okay, so what's public goods? And this is it's a bit of a slippery concept to get your head around. It's something that has no inherent financial value. So we can't go around and say, well, that's worth 20 quid. But we all benefit from it. But we can't stop people using it because they can access it without us. We can't interfere and they still carry on using it. And we can't stop them from anybody doing that. So the list that the government has officially come up with, and it's not actually correct, but we're just going to have to go with the government because that's what they've decided. It's under the Agriculture Act 2020. These are the public goods that the government now want farmers to focus their efforts on. So instead of paying farmers to produce food, which is what used to happen up until about 1984, and then it was like, okay, we want you to support agri-environment, and then it was rural diversification. Now we're going to help you focus on producing these things. So it's things like clean air and water. Yes, we all need that. Public access, management that helps cultural and or natural heritage. I'll come back to that. Climate change, environmental hazards management, they're all really important things. And we rely on farming to actually help us address some of these things. We can't just ignore farming and say we want it to go away, because we actually need people who understand land management. So in order to manage land without using farmers, the cost almost doubles. So if you get what I would call a countryside manager in a ranger or something to do it, cost doubles. So it's actually cheaper to allow people to carry on farming who actually know their land and understand their land and where all the difficulties lie. It's called local knowledge, and it's not valued very much by the government. So there's all these things that we could do. And then basically what's happened is that DEFRA has come out with a range of schemes, and there's a stopgap called the Farming and Protected Areas Scheme. And that's a protected landscapes, and that's just for national parks and AONBs, and that's a 3-year programme. So we've had year 1, and we're now into years 2 and 3. And then after that, we will go into what's called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, and there are different types of scheme, which will be fully running from 2024. I'll look at these in a bit more detail in a minute. And the idea is that you're paid money for public goods. That's what it is. What that money is, what those rates are, is I'm afraid we're going to have to get the Ouija board out, because we still don't know, and we've been waiting for 2 years. And you're trying to manage a business and you still don't know, and you're trying to manage a process which is probably an 12 to 18 month process. How do you make a decision when you don't know what the rates are to make the best decision for your business so that your business can continue? So there are some holes in it, but we know it's coming. The Farming and Protected Landscapes project is there as a stopgap to move from point A to point B, to help farmers make the transition from having what we call the BPS, which I've completely forgotten what it means. Thank you. Basic payment scheme, which is a hectareage scheme, so paying for the amount of land that you have. Take that away gradually and replace it, and encourage people to do these schemes instead. It's all voluntary. BPS wasn't, you got it because you were in a particular area with livestock farming and so on and so forth. But yeah, now this is a voluntary scheme, so you cannot not to do it if you don't want to. So you could get a situation, if those rates aren't good enough, farmers will go 2-fingered salute, we're not playing, and I'm going to go and intensify. And that is a risk, is that some farmers will decide not to engage with this process because when they look at the figures and do the maths, it's not going to work for them. So even though we want people to do public goods, and I'm fairly certain that 99% of farmers, they would look down that list and say, yes, those things are really important. If the money's not right and they can't do it for their farm business, then they will say, I can't go into that, I'm going to do something else. So they will diversify into other activities, or they will intensify. And hey, we've lost then the nature that we want. Soon there will be less money. That's the issue. Okay. There isn't going to be the same amount of money that was available in the BPS. It's just not feasible. There's going to be less money. So at some point, there's going to be a lot less money. So now is the time to act and actually think about the opportunities that you have on your farm and think in different ways about how farm assets can be used. Second thing you can do, well, these are sort of give you an idea of what these schemes are about. The Sustainable Farming Incentive, it's in its pilot phase. So what they do is they try and run a pilot and work out all the bugs and then roll it out properly in 2024. And this rewards farmers for managing land in environmentally sensitive ways. So it's built on the environmentally sensitive area schemes, ESAs, social stewardship, things that you may have heard of previously. The idea is they're supposed to have learned from that and then apply and then roll out this scheme. So they're in the pilot phase at the moment, and various farmers were invited to participate if they wanted to. So it's all about improving farm woods, hedgerows, low and no input grassland, water body buffering, all things that are really sensible, but they still need to be able to fit within the farming business system. And the idea is there are 3 levels with increasing complexity and increasing expectation, but hopefully increasing money. Going up in scale, so that's at the farm scale, you can have a local nature recovery project, and that's a pilot for this year, and then it'll be launched fully in 2024. And the idea here is groups of farmers come together and work together for local needs, and local needs means the local environmental needs. So these are the sorts of things that the government are interested in people doing: reversing biodiversity decline, improving water quality, net zero, climate change resilience, heritage and access. So there are things in there. So the idea is you get a group of farmers to come together and work together. And you would think in a commoning system that that would be something that people who are used to working together might be able to think about. However, as I'm sure Julia told you, who came and spoke about commoning, that we're all just like normal people. We fall out with each other. And then at the next scale, I've got a complete landscape scale. There's huge giant schemes that they're trying to roll out. They've got 12 that they want to roll out this year. They're not really directed at farmers, they're directed at other sorts of landscape. And what they're trying to do there is encourage biodiversity, water quality and net zero to be addressed. So it might be that the whole Windermere catchment is looked at as a whole. It's not really directed at farmers. The government isn't really thinking that they're going to get lots of farmers to engage with the landscape recovery scheme. So they're looking at huge projects of between 5,000 hectares, actually looking for the bigger scale projects. And they have different themes each year. The themes for this year is to restore and recover threatened native species and to restore streams and rivers. But it depends on your context as to what you do and what goes on in your valley as to what you think is appropriate. You can work together, okay? And you can see now that with the sorts of schemes that are coming forward, there is a greater need for farming to people to work together, not just farmers, but different land managers and landowners. I don't need to tell you about this, but it is held up as a shining beacon. It really is. What Danny did and how he went through all the process of what he did has been poured over to try and understand how we can replicate that in other parts of the Lake District, because it is transformational what Danny has done and what the people who work with Danny have done, thinking about linking sustainable farming, conservation and flood management together. It really is cutting edge stuff, but it was very organic, and you all know why it occurred. I don't need to tell you, I don't need to suck eggs at all. But actually the way in which Danny goes about it and the way he negotiates and the way he works with agencies and acts almost like a broker is really important. It gives people agency. And agency is one of the things that's increasingly missing within the farming community, is people who can have the dialogue and not worry about talking to people like the Environment Agency and not worry about talking to good old DEFRA or the RPA or the other horrors that exist. But it's difficult, you know, if you're running a small farm and you've got your head down and it's a 17-hour day, you haven't got time to stick your head over the parapet. You need advocacy and you need agency. And so people like Danny are really important for that. And there's one that's starting to get going in Wasdale, very similar, with a key sort of, what we call a sort of key agent, one person who's stepping up into that position like Danny and saying, bringing everybody together. And those people have to be respected and there has to be trust and all that sort of stuff. And people who live and work in the community are respected and trusted, and people learn who to respect and trust. And all that sort of stuff is really important to allow these sorts of projects to move forward. So Ullswater is right at the cutting edge of this nationally. And you always be really proud of that because it's just a fabulous story. Obviously, things go wrong, it doesn't quite work, and people fall out, and all the usual life stuff. But actually, what Danny has accomplished is absolutely groundbreaking. And it's a bit depressing in some ways, but actually, it's fabulous in others because other people are coming here and looking at it and going, wow, I wish we could do that. How do we do it? So one of the things you might want to think about is, Danny needs help. Perhaps thinking about whole valley plan. What can you do for the whole valley? How can you bring all that stuff together, the culture, the nature, the businesses, everybody, and move forward together? And there are whole valley plan examples. Long Sleddle have done one. Who else has done one? Kirkoswald and Lois have done one. So there are places where they've done whole valley farms to allow them, whole valley plans to allow them to move forward and get consensus. They're working on one in Staley and Kentmin. You might want to do some regenerative farming. I'll tip my hat to Galbar Hall, who are in the audience. So, different way of farming, different way of thinking about restoring ecological balance in systems through a whole farm approach. There is no agreed definition of regenerative farming. I'm sure everybody has their own opinion, but when I was trying to get a definition to explain it to people who don't know about regenerative farming, I was trying to pick something that people could sort of grasp, because there's loads of stuff out there. There was a really boring academic paper, and they'd gone out and done a survey what it meant, and they'd come up with 422 ways of explaining regenerative farming. I just thought, well, that's hopeless. So I worked something really simple to get my head around it properly. And what they're doing basically is 5 principles of regenerative agriculture. Minimising soil disruption. I can't read that, sorry, I haven't got glasses. I'm getting old. Don't we all? Here we go. Oh, we'll come back and focus. Keeping soil covered with plants, so that stops soil erosion and deterioration. Having crop diversity, that's quite tricky in the uplands. Really difficult to do because if you remember, we're grade 4, grade 5 land. So not every principle fits with our situation up here. No synthetic chemicals, well, that saves money, you can get away with it, and planned grazing. So what goes on at Galbar is a really good example of that on a small scale, and it's really interesting in the way that they've developed the business, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. The issue is that the majority of upland farmers are in a poverty trap. They're caught. So making a switch from A to B without crippling their business is a really big deal for a lot of them. If I was to tell you that the average take-home pay, what we call gross margin, for an upland farmer in this country is £5,000 a year. Okay, so if you haven't got capital to pump into changing from system A to system B, it's very frightening. There's a massive risk there. Your whole business could go down the Swanee. So it's trying to find ways to get people to help people switch from A to B in a way that fits their business, which comes back to the point is every farm is different, and therefore every farm needs advice in a different way. And it's particularly difficult where you've got sheep where we've lost winter grazing, so the winter grazing isn't going on the fells anymore, because usually you can put your sheep up there to allow you to have less intensive farming in other parts of the farm system. But with not being able to put your sheep on the fell anymore in winter, you can't bring them back to the farm because that will knacker your regenerative system. So you've got to put them somewhere else. So you've got to overwinter them out of the Lake District, and that puts costs up massively because in effect you're sort of renting your sheep and the land somewhere else. So that causes problems, because so how can we adjust that system to allow sheep farmers to get involved in regenerative farming? So we need to find examples where people started from the same position as many of these farmers who've got £5,000 gross margin a year. There's also the issue of peer pressure. Anything new, people go, ooh, shouldn't be doing that. And when you're in a cultural environment like this, where generations of people have worked in farming, it's very difficult for people to do something innovative. And there are examples of farmers have been shunned completely because they've done something that not everybody else is doing. And that's really hard psychologically and for your mental welfare and all the rest of it. And for your family and your kids and your uncles and aunties and all that, what they're doing is a bit weird. And there's a lot of peer pressure in farming about tradition and how things are done. And you have to take that on board when you're thinking about asking people to change their farming system and the way they farm. You're asking them to remake themselves almost psychologically. And the agricultural curriculum that's taught for 16 to 18-year-olds still doesn't contain enough environmental information. So we're not even helping the youngsters to get their heads around the changes that they need to do, because the curriculum is so rigid and it's so focused on agriculture and not on the new stuff they need to do. There's very little information about how to do regenerative farming for sheep enterprises. So this is a big missing block. There's stuff about lowland regenerative sheep farming, and I found stuff in other countries, but I haven't really found anything about what the sorts of issues that we're facing up here. So there needs to be more information and more experimentation, but in a safe way. You can't experiment and bugger somebody's business up, because as an academic, I can just walk away and go back to my job. I work for Natural England, for example. I can walk away and go back to my job. But if you buggered it up for the farmer, that's it. Excuse my French. So visitor economy, massive. Let's do it. It's the sorts of very traditional things that people will diversify. B&B. We're going to need more B&B. There still isn't enough B&B in the Lake District, particularly as we've seen over the last couple of years. I almost hope it doesn't get as bad as that, because it was just awful. I work in Ambleside. It was just, and I have a problem because I don't have any accommodation for my students for next year. I've got 50 students who've got nowhere to live because of vacation, and I'm thinking, where am I going to put them? So, you know, in some ways we can be over visited. I would like some of them to go away to solve my accommodation problem. But you can do all sorts of different things. Some of these things you already do. Ullswater Way, as your organisation, you're doing masses to help with the visitor economy, because part of the job is to educate people about why the landscape looks the way it does. Why are we farming in this way? Why is it important to have pasture? Why is it important to have sheep? What's the issue in relation to veganism? You actually have to tackle these things head on and explain net zero and livestock and carbon and all the rest of it in a way that visitors actually begin to appreciate where their food comes from, why it's important that we support farming, why the landscape looks the way it does. Real farm holidays. We don't do very much of that over here. In other countries, it's big business. Actually engaging people with living on the farm and working on the farm, really important. Ullswater Grand, the one I picked, was the Lake District Tweed, Maria Benjamin. You know, these are the sorts of things that are really important, to different things that drive the economy forward, but they're all interlinked with the farming community, using local wool. Local wool, fleeces get bugger all money now. Okay, and it's finding different ways of using that wool to allow income to get back onto the farm. They're not looking for a fortune. They want to have a satisfactory income so they can carry on living on the farm, so the business doesn't just survive, but it thrives, as we say. Why shouldn't they? They're entitled to everything just like the rest of us. Although, from this morning, I'm wondering about the electricity bill. And, you know, perhaps thinking about supporting local economic development, you know, micro businesses, putting stuff together, having an Ullswater brand shop might be something you might want to think about as a community. I've just done a project with some booklets over there called What Did Farming Ever Do For Us? And it was a booklet that I got a FIPL grant for, and I worked with the Herbert Breeders Association and the National Trust, and Action for Cumbria and the Farmers Network. And basically what it does is it shows how cultural landscapes can be used to address nature recovery and climate action. So trying to give ideas about how to move from point A to point B for farmers that perhaps they haven't thought about previously. So hopefully everybody will be getting a drop of that coming through their door in the next couple of weeks. So it's just helping people get ideas about the opportunities that are actually there, rather than people feeling they're being beaten with a stick all the time, because farmers do get a bad press. They're constantly under the cosh for this or that or the other, almost like all of society's ills. And it's like, hang on a minute, we're all driving cars that chuck loads of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and all sorts of other shit. We're just as equally responsible. Farm woods are probably one of the most underutilised resources on farms nowadays. I was very lucky to be given a Churchill Fellowship, and I went to Japan and actually looked at their farming systems in margin areas and tried to learn from them. And one of the big things they think is really important is making sure that farm woods are used effectively. And there's a lot of farm wood out there in the uplands. It's very underutilised. There's about 10,000 hectares of it, we think, in England, but we don't even know. We don't have the information. We don't have the level of information. I don't know how much woodland there is in Ullswater Valley. I don't even think the Forestry Commission do, even though they did a census in, I think the last one was in 2005. They don't know how much woodland there is because haven't got that level of detail on the ground. But actually, on a day-to-day basis, operationally, that's really important to know what your assets are, so you can actually realise them effectively. So why are farm woods underutilised? It's a labour shortage. As farming's fallen into the cost price squeeze, i.e. the cost of production and the prices you get lower and lower and the costs get higher and higher, you've had to shed labour. So farms that used to have 9, 10 people working on them, they're down to 1. So that one person's trying to do everything. Often the partner or the other half of the business is off doing a job off site, so they can't help. So farm woods were one of the first things that went. I don't need to manage that. It's not producing an income. Don't bother with it. And it's become undermanaged and an underutilised resource. And as time's gone by, people have lost the skills as well in order to actually know what skills they need in order to manage their wood and bring it back online. There's an equipment shortage. Forestry equipment's very expensive. As a small farm, you can't afford big bits of kit to do whatever it is you need to do. There's a lack of grants for undermanaged woods. It's something I'm talking to a chap on the Forestry Commission. What are we going to do about all these undermanaged woods? What can we do to help people get their woods back online? Because you get biodiversity, get monster biodiversity from woodland. It allows connection with other landscapes and other habitats, and ecologically it's fab. So help people help themselves to utilise this, get it back online, get it productive, get it useful. And there are a lack of markets. And we also have a range of different types of woodland as well. So a gillwood is completely useless from a timber point of view, but it's really important from a biodiversity point of view. So different types of wood are important in different contexts. Again, we don't know how much gillwood there is. I haven't got a clue in the Lake District. Don't know anything. It's awful, isn't it? You know, it's our countryside and we don't know very much at all. So what can we do? Novel labour systems. If there's not enough labour on the farm, then how can we work collectively to have almost like a peripatetic set of foresters going around, helping bring all these woodlands back online for a fee? And then you've got different farmers learning new skills, developing their skills, getting back online, reskilling, getting their woodland and their marketing skills up. And then that peripatetic group of foresters could move on again. They do this in Japan, so why don't we do it here? The Japanese are brilliant at coming over here, picking up all our great ideas and then running off over there and going, hey, let's do this and making it even better. You know, we need to learn from them. We need to learn different ways. If we got it right in Europe and we've got it right in the European Union, we've got it right in the UK, we wouldn't have an upland farming system that's on its knees. So there's obviously something wrong with how we're doing it if we're not getting it right. You know, even the ESA scheme, which ran from 1986 to 2005, I think it was, 2014, sorry. It only maintained the status quo. It didn't improve habitat. It just held it where it was. If it hadn't been there, the landscape would have been completely knackered. Excuse my French. Okay, so the ESA did some good. It held the wall, basically. It held the line. So we need to reskill people. We need to have equipment pools so you don't have to buy all this really expensive kit. Farmers need support with the paperwork. The felling license stuff is just phenomenal, and what you can do and what you can't do and how you do it and when you do it and how many legs you stand on and the rest of it. So they need help to get through all the paperwork system just to get the woodland back online and actually start realising some of the timber. We need better grants for them, as I say, talking to the Forestry Commission about that. Or you can have novel high market value goods. So what we've got here, everybody's looking at this tree going, oh God, that's terrible. The shipbuilder would bite your arm off for that tree, because those limbs could be used to make the carcass of a wooden boat. They'd absolutely love it. So things like that go for huge amounts of money just one tree. This is shiitake mushrooms. They grow them in Japan on bits of oak logs. The climate conditions are absolutely identical to the Lake District. So we could grow shiitake mushrooms. You can grow them in a barn with air blowing through, warm air blowing through. Shiitake mushrooms, mega money. This is a really good one. This is a black pizza. Does anybody know what's in the dough? It's charcoal. Okay, so they grow wood for charcoal, coppice wood, and they grind it up into a powder and they put it in their cooking. And you can have biscuits and ice cream. It doesn't taste gritty at all. Okay, but it's novel food which adds value. So if you go to Wagamama's, the weird fusion, Asian fusion restaurant chain in this country, they've got black noodles on the menu. It's not squidding, it's charcoal. So it's high value products. If we could actually get a really high coppice value charcoal, grind it up and do stuff like that. It's all those stupid novel things that actually people go, wow, it's the best pizza I've ever tasted. Okay? Didn't have any cheese on it, just had fruit on it. It was fabulous. Really good. And then wood turning, all those small industries, people are always looking for materials. So it's looking for all that niche market stuff, which actually often these things come on very high price for the amount of effort that you have to put in. And it's those sorts of things, there are opportunities that farming needs to begin to think about to move away from this reliance on livestock. Because basically the issue is we've got too many sheep and we need good quality but less sheep, so and less cows. So if we're going to do that, we need to find other ways of bringing farm income onto the farm. Carbon offsetting. Everybody goes, yay, brilliant. Oh God, it fills me with horror. I'll explain why. So in case you don't know what it is, it's the action or process of compensating for carbon dioxide emissions arising from industrial or human activity by participating in schemes designed to make equivalent reductions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So in English, it's a little process. Carbon emissions generated, things like overseas holidays, airplane companies, Procter & Gamble, squatting down at Trafford Park. Person purchases carbon offset, funds used to support projects that actually suck up carbon, so things like tree planting, fog restoration, renewable energy, and these projects in turn reduce CO2. That sounds brilliant, sounds really good, what a great idea. But it's not actually addressing the issue in the first place, it's just holding it, it's holding the line again, because eventually we're going to run out of trees and bogs to save. It's great if you can do it on a small scale and the farmer's getting the income on a small scale, that's brilliant. And bog restoration fields is really important because we get loads of extra stuff for that. It helps with sedimentation and erosion, and it stops reservoirs filling up with crap and putting up our water bills and we have to clean it all out. The issue we've got is there's some really scary stuff going on in relation to whole farm purchase now. And large investment companies are stalking farmers in Wales at the moment. They're actually cold calling them and saying, would you like to sell your farm to us and we'll give you trillions of pounds and we're going to cover it in trees. And the issue is okay, well, that sounds great, that gives us trees, but you can see here, it's trees, miles and miles of trees on parade. What's that going to do? So conifers cause all sorts of soil problems in relation to acidification of the soil. We learnt that round Thirlmere. And what happens is the water dies because all the crap goes into the river and into the water body and it destroys it. So how it's done is really important. These companies are actually beginning to destroy. They're really worried about rural communities in Wales. As farms are bought up and farm families move out, that destabilises the local economy. It means there are less people in the schools, less people using the shops and the services, and then the whole lot begins to spiral downwards. So it sounds great, carbon offsetting, but it needs to be done in a way that doesn't destabilise the rural economy. If the policy is that they want us to all go and live in urban areas, then that's it. But at the moment, levelling up agenda, and we want everybody to be equal, and it will be lovely. And we want people to live in rural areas and so on and so forth. So we need to be careful that we don't end up with a situation where we're solving one problem but creating another. And there's a nice little article there. I'm sure it will pick it up on the system when you save it and put it on the. So if you want to read about the horrors that are going on in Wales, or you don't want to because the thought that's just too horrifying, it's there for you. And then the last thing, and people forget this, is hey, we need food. We do actually need food, and people often forget all these new agendas that we have. We still need to produce food. In 2021, we were only 60% self-sufficient of food in this country, self-sufficient. In 1984, it was 78%. That's got a little graph. Come on, graph. There it is. So that peaked in 1984, and it's a gradual downwards trend. And if we relied on our own food to feed us at the moment, 60% means we'd only get to the 21st of August, and then after that, it's no food. So, of course, what we do is we buy food in, and by buying food in, that buggers the balance of trade, but it causes all sorts of other problems in relation to shipping stuff and fuel and petrol and all the rest of it. So surely it would be better to actually supply our own food as best we can. It's also of strategic importance. The other thing we've got is that the pattern's extremely variable. So some food stuff we're very self-sufficient in. The other sitting there going, oh, look at lamb, we've got 100% of lamb, so we can get rid of sheep on the fells. The trouble is that a large chunk of that lamb, we export it to other countries, so we don't actually benefit from it in this country. It goes for export. So then the amount of self-sufficiency drops, and it's a double-edged sword because export is really good because people want high-quality product in other countries, and that's great because then that means you get more money going back down to the farm. But if you're actually trying to feed yourself and become more self-sufficient as a nation, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, as I said. So it always seems a bit bonkers is that we import more milk from France than we produce our own milk now. Why? Why? Because there's lots of dairy farmers have gone out of business. Why are we doing that? Why are we importing milk? Most of the southeast of England, the milk you buy on the shelves is from France. It's not produced in the UK. Why are we doing that? We've got a really good dairy industry. So Cumbria, our uplands are really important because they have what we call comparative advantage. It means that we can actually produce livestock, and we can produce livestock leaving the more flexible land for other crops. If we produce the livestock, which we're good at, and allow other areas to produce the other crops in the UK. It also helps drive locally produced foods, and that's become increasingly important over the years. We all want to try and buy as much as we can locally because it supports the local economy, it supports farmers, but it also means we know where our food's coming from, and provenance is becoming increasingly important for people who need to buy food. And that keeps money in the local economy, and that local economy the money goes round and round and round and creates a circular economy, and it helps all the other businesses. And it allows people to stay living in rural areas, and it allows the school to have enough kids to carry on running. The issue is for Cumbria Uplands is it's quality and not quantity. So the sorts of things, that's why the whole package really, if we want that balance with that umbrella in the World Heritage Site, it's trying to find the middle ground. So it's trying to find ways that we allow for quality, but not quantity, so not overgrazing. But we don't want to undergraze so much that it destabilises the farming system. And that's the tricky bit, because it's different on every fell, because of the habitats vary from fell to fell. And that's the really hard bit, it's trying to help people work out where the best balance is. And some organisations are in too much of a rush to get to, we need to get all the sheep off the fell now. And in doing so, you're destabilising the farming economy, which destabilises the rural economy, which has a massive impact, not just on the farming community, but on everybody else who lives in the rural area. So in summary, there is space for both nature and culture in a balanced way. I actually do believe that, which is why I started this talk by saying, yes, there is a future for upland farming in Cumbria and in Ullswater. It's absolutely crucial because there is so much we get from it, we benefit from it. Upland farming is absolutely central. I just do truly believe that. It's very complex, and that's part of the issue. The complexity makes it difficult to help in the right ways. And the government often has to go for big, broad, top-down stuff because that's the best they can do. But why? We could have actually spent the money that we've spent on all these other schemes actually giving one-to-one farm advice, and we probably would have spent less money doing that, giving one. Come on, buttons. Oh, it's gone to sleep now. It says, Lois, shut up. So in order to do it, we need to respect the various views to help us work together. And there's still a way to go there to respect other people's points of view. It's not one or the other. It's not vegans versus vegetarians versus meatheads. It's not nature conservation versus flood management versus farmers. If we don't actually find that balance, this landscape will change forever, and we will have lost so much. And in the process, we won't have the people with the skills who actually know how to manage this landscape on a large scale. We don't have the money to do it in other ways. So there's lots of opportunities to explore and support a range of opportunities. It's picking the right thing for the right farm in the right farm business in the right place. And it is that thrive rather than survive. So those opportunities, as we've seen, we can looking at the public goods agenda, but be careful. Partnership working, absolutely fabulous example here in Ullswater. Thinking about other farm business models, not just regenerative farming. It might not work for some people, but there are other systems out there to look at. So it's the ability and the opportunity to look at different farming systems to start trying to move from point A to point B in a way that doesn't destabilise the farm business. We need to make sure we embrace the visitor economy and the World Heritage Site. I know the World Heritage Site gets a bad press, but it's there, so use it to our advantage, not push against it. So there are ways of making it work for us, even if you don't approve of it as a concept or you think it's done nothing. There are ways to make it to help us drive our rural economy forward using it. Well-managed carbon offsetting, absolutely. And we do need to remember that food supply is absolutely crucial. So, nice picture at the end. So I always think Upland agriculture sits in the middle of that web and everything swirls around it. I'm sure somebody from a different point of view will put a different bubble in the middle and have everything else swirling around it. But I truly believe it's an integrated system. If we actually get it right, everybody will benefit. Nature, climate, people, agriculture, visitors. Visitors will have a better experience. Farmers will thrive rather than survive. Because, as the Law Act says, there's someone like you who cares a whole awful lot. Nothing is going to get better, it's not. And those of you that have read the Law Acts, you know what happened was all the trees, the truculent trees all got chopped down and everybody suddenly went, oh dear, what do we do now? And I would hate hill farming to go that way. Thank you very much.
Lois, what an absolutely masterful presentation. I was looking at the audience. Now, if you talk for an hour and 20 minutes, which you've done, I was wondering whether to.
Sorry, Jim, would you mind taking your mask off?
Sorry.
Thank you.
If you talk for an hour and 20 minutes, which you've done, and I haven't seen a single person doze off, I don't know what's happened on the.
Some people might be
the
very
Zoom.
good at it.
My sense is that you create that energy and vitality and enthusiasm. No, you captured people in a very special way, and you've given us a lot of ideas to think of. You know, a couple of things came on my mind when we were talking about Ullswater being a pioneering place for agricultural systems, and we have some pioneers in the audience. That, we are a special place here, and you talk about branding for Ullswater. And when you mentioned that, I was again looking at the audience. So, wow, yeah, and people, well, yeah, that's a nice idea, sort of thing. It sort of puts you, makes the mind turn over. When you talked about, well, we don't know anything about Ullswater. We don't know about Crom. We don't know the number of hedges. We don't know about biodiversity. We have a job to do. Actually, as you know, as an NGO involved in trying to understand and explain, make people aware about the environment. Why don't we go out and do it? I mean, we started that process. Some parts of this community are already doing that. And I was even on my way here in the car, I was talking about the possibility of us getting involved in archaeological surveys, which haven't been done in Ullswater for over 20 years, apart from the one of the lake in Hartsop. Why can't we mobilise volunteers? And you say it's easy to do. You taught yourself how to understand habitats and so on. So I think you've actually thrown down the challenge in a very interesting way. It's quite late. What are we going to do? Have we got questions on the? Maybe why this? Does anyone from the audience like to respond, ask questions, or comment on the presentation?
We were just getting lots of thank you very much. Very interesting.
Mike.
Very, very useful. Thank you very much for that. I noticed you didn't mention rewilding. Hot topic. Which in this area. But that fit in? There's a great incentive on rewilding, the government supporting the idea of rewilding, and learning, active learning, which is really going against all the political. And then my other point is the question of underrated. Rewilding really worries me, unless it's in the marginal uplands.
We are, but then people say we
Let me
are the
just-
marginal
Let me
uplands.
just, so the question coming from Miles McInnes for the Zoom audience is rewilding, it's a big topic. Is it relevant here? What are your concerns about that? And the second issue was about the problem of undergrazing. What can you do to address that issue?
Rewilding is a very contentious topic. I think the way to look at it is that there is a spectrum that we need to look at. So at one end is rewilding, and at the other end is intensive cereal farming. And there's everything in between. And we can't rewild the whole country because we won't be able to produce any food, and we do need to produce food. It's as simple as that. So there are possibilities for rewilding parts of the country, but the decision is who rewilds. And to me, that's part of the debate about taking agency from people, about taking their right to decide what they do on their own land, rather than having it indoctrinated on them. So philosophically, I'm actually quite against rewilding from that point of view, from an agency point of view, but I'm also against it because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about what rewilding actually means in reality. And there are lots of different interpretations of it. And I have colleagues who would like to see the links return, but the links wouldn't actually survive in the Lake District because it has a very large range and it just wouldn't work. And there are many other issues, local community and so on and so forth. So I think there is room for rewilding, but in very particular ways. But I don't think it's going to be something that the Lake District should embrace wholeheartedly, because I think we can use upland farming to get us most of the way there in a different way. From that point of view, the undergrazing issue, yes, it's a problem. There's lots of anecdotal evidence that it's a problem, and there is an issue about the belief that that undergrazing does actually occur, because it's the ability to generate the evidence to prove that there is undergrazing. There is evidence of undergrazing in other national parks and in other upland areas. And again, it's all about making sure that we have the information. So if anybody's got any information about undergrazing, I'd love to hear about it, please.
Any questions from the Zoomers? Any more questions from the floor? Yeah. Helen.
So earlier you mentioned our in communicating the complexities of farming and the issues that we face in the country. What's your view on Jeremy Clarkson's farm?
So she's asked a question about Mondial. We know about Mondial, but what is Lewis's view on Clarkson and his farming enterprise?
Yeah, and from that point of view, it's really good that he's doing what he's doing. But he's got the luxury of having a job that generates income off the farm. And this is the big issue for lots of small farms in this country as a whole, is they don't have that backup of lots of money to allow their system to adjust and do the right thing. And that's why they need help to make the transition from A to B. I will say I haven't watched any of it at all, because some things just make my blood pressure go up massively, and it's better for me to avoid them. I know when George Monbiot came up here and everybody said, "Oh, you're going to go and listen to what he's got to say." I said, "No, I can't, because I'm just going to get so upset that I can't. I will be so inarticulate. I won't, and I'll probably do something I regret afterwards." So I didn't go and even listen to the rantings of Mr. Monbiot at all either.
One more question. Okay, let me ask you once again to applaud our high quality and thought-provoking. I think that's really everyone leaving this hall maybe start thinking in their own way how they can respond to the challenges which you thrown down.